Pacific Ocean, early 1943. A thin line of moonlight ripples across the surface as USS Tenosa rises slowly from the dark. Inside the control room, the air is thick with diesel fumes and tension. The crew moves with quiet precision, men who have spent months underwater, stalking an enemy they rarely see but constantly feel. Tonight, they have the perfect target, a Japanese tanker, heavy with fuel and moving alone, unaware of the shadow following it. Commander Dick O'Kane studies the silhouette through his periscope. Distance, bearing, speed, everything matches the textbook ideal. His torpedo men load the tubes with Mark 14s, the standard weapon of the U.S. submarine fleet. The crew believes in their captain. But none of them fully trust the weapon sliding into the chamber. The order cuts through the silence. Fire one. A hiss. A shudder. A white trail knifes through the water. The torpedo reaches the target, and nothing. No explosion. No plume. No shockwave. Just silence. O'Kane clenches his jaw. He fires again. Another perfect solution. Another perfect run. Another failure. What the crew does not know, but will soon suspect, is that this is not bad luck. It is not a miscalculation. It is not the enemy's cunning. It is the torpedo itself. For almost 2 years, American submarines have gone to war with a weapon that fails more often than it works. A torpedo that runs too deep, explodes too early, or doesn't explode at all. A design flaw born from bureaucratic pride, institutional blindness, and a refusal to retest a weapon already declared perfect. And so, in those cramped steel corridors beneath the Pacific, frustration builds like pressure inside a hull. Submarine commanders write reports. Engineers dismiss them. Patrol after patrol returns with incredible firing solutions, and disappointing results. The Mark 14 is supposed to be a miracle of American engineering. Instead, it becomes a quiet catastrophe, one that few officers dare to challenge openly. But here, in the open ocean, truth cannot be hidden. Not when a submarine risks everything for a single moment of attack, only to watch its best chance for survival vanish in a silent, harmless splash. Tonight, the crew of Tenosa will experience what countless American submariners already fear. Their greatest enemy is not always the Imperial Japanese Navy. Sometimes, it is the weapon meant to protect them. Before the war began, the U.S. Navy placed enormous faith in the Mark 14 torpedo. On paper, it was a masterpiece. Longer range, deeper running, a magnetic exploder designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, where a single blast could break a vessel in half. It was the kind of weapon that promised efficiency, precision, and technological superiority. But there was a problem. A fundamental one. The Mark 14 had almost never been tested under real combat conditions. During the 1930s, budgets were tight, torpedoes were expensive, and the Bureau of Ordnance, Board, believed its design teams. They conducted limited trials, mostly using exercise heads and shallow shots. No full depth, full speed, live warhead tests. No stress tests at realistic temperatures or pressure. The Navy saved money, signed the approval papers, and declared the Mark 14 ready for service. What followed was an illusion of reliability. When the war erupted in the Pacific, submarines became one of America's most important tools. A single submarine could isolate a convoy, track it for hours, then deliver a precise attack. But as patrols increased in late 1941 and early 1942, something was wrong, terribly wrong. Captains began reporting strange failures. Torpedoes that dove deeper than set. Torpedoes that struck and failed to explode. Torpedoes that curved off course. And magnetic detonators that triggered hundreds of meters early. One commander wrote that his torpedoes were perfect until they touched reality. But BUORD dismissed many of these reports. They blamed the crews, the calculations, even the weather. They insisted the weapon could not be flawed. Institutional pride had hardened into something more dangerous: denial. Meanwhile, American submarines hunted across thousands of miles, from the Philippines to the Solomons, often operating alone, often under immense pressure. These crews understood the cost of a failed attack. A torpedo that didn't detonate didn't just waste a shot, it exposed their location. It forced them to dive deep and escape under the threat of depth charges. Every failure chipped away at morale. Every unexplained miss deepened suspicion. Every silent hit tested the patience of men who relied on absolute precision. By early 1943, whispers traveled through submarine bases at Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Brisbane. Officers shared their frustrations in quiet corners of the wardroom. Torpedo men swapped stories in repair shops. Everyone sensed the same truth. The torpedo wasn't reliable, and the Navy didn't want to admit it. This tension, between the men risking their lives and the institutions sworn to equip them, became one of the most dangerous invisible battles of the early Pacific War. A battle fought not with guns or depth charges, but with reports, accusations, silence, and bureaucracy. And every patrol that went out carried this uncertainty. Will the torpedo work this time? Or will it betray them again? By mid-1942, the problem could no longer be dismissed as bad luck. Patrol after patrol returned with stories that sounded unbelievable on paper, but were painfully real for the men who lived them. One submarine reported 6 hits with 0 detonations. Another fired a perfect spread at a transport ship, only to watch every torpedo dive beneath the hull like stones dropping off a pier. A third vessel struck a destroyer squarely amidships, heard the metallic clang, and then nothing. No fire. No explosion. Just the destroyer turning toward them at full speed. For submarine crews, this wasn't embarrassing. It was terrifying. The Pacific was not a forgiving battlefield. Every attack required exposing the boat, rising close enough to the surface to fire, calculating the enemy's speed, committing to a course. Once the torpedoes left the tubes, the submarine became vulnerable. Success meant survival. Failure meant being hunted. Depth charges didn't care about bureaucratic arguments. In Fremantle, Australia, experienced skippers began confronting the issue directly. They compared notes, depth-keeping errors, premature detonations, circular runs, torpedoes that looped back toward the submarine that fired them. More than one commander admitted privately that he feared his own weapon more than the enemy. Yet, when they sent detailed reports to the Bureau of Ordnance, the responses felt almost identical. Crew error. Misjudged depth. Faulty targeting. The men who depended on these weapons felt insulted and endangered. These were not inexperienced officers. Many had spent years perfecting the precise art of submarine warfare. Their reputations were being questioned, while the weapon remained beyond scrutiny. The conflict grew hotter when frontline combat veterans, men who had stared down destroyers and lived through relentless depth charging, were told by desk officers thousands of miles away that they simply needed better practice. But the Pacific provided its own proof. One patrol reported a Japanese freighter dead in the water, motionless, helpless. The submarine fired a single Mark 14 at close range. The torpedo struck and simply sank beneath the target. No explosion. No damage. The freighter restarted its engines and slowly escaped into the horizon. Moments like these left crews stunned. You could see it in their faces when they returned to port, a mix of exhaustion, frustration, and quiet disbelief. They had done everything right, and still failed. And then came the first moments of real anger. Captains began speaking openly to their flotilla commanders. Some demanded permission to test torpedoes themselves. Others insisted on disabling the magnetic exploder entirely. A few, in private, considered refusing combat patrols until the issue was addressed. This was no longer a technical annoyance. It was a crisis of trust. A weapon the Navy considered perfect was now costing opportunities, damaging morale, and endangering submarines during the very moments they needed reliability most. And deep inside this growing storm, the officers closest to the problem sensed something dangerous. If the torpedo truly was flawed, then the silence protecting it could cost the United States the war beneath the Pacific. The turning point began quietly, almost accidentally. At Pearl Harbor, A handful of frustrated submarine captains pushed for something simple: live-fire tests with real warheads. It was an idea that should have been standard practice. Yet for nearly a decade, the Bureau of Ordnance had resisted it, claiming the tests were too expensive and unnecessary. Every failure, they argued, came from the crews, not the weapon. But by 1943, the pressure could no longer be contained. In early summer, Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Charles Lockwood, practical, sharp, and deeply trusted by his skippers, received yet another wave of reports. Missed attacks, torpedoes running too deep, impact failures, magnetic detonators triggering mid-ocean. Lockwood had heard enough. He ordered a controlled test near Kahoolawe, firing Mark 14s at a steel cliff face to measure their depth and detonation performance. The results were immediate and devastating. The torpedoes were running 10 to 12 feet deeper than the settings indicated. Some struck the cliff and did not detonate at all. Others exploded prematurely, long before reaching the target. The weapon that Board insisted was flawless had just proven itself dangerously unreliable under real conditions. Lockwood's reaction was not dramatic. It was calm, almost cold. He simply said, "If the damn torpedo won't run at the proper depth, then we'll fix it ourselves." The tests continued. Engineers removed exploders, disabled magnetic triggers, inspected firing pins, weighed units, and compared every part against the original blueprints. What they found confirmed the worst fears of every submarine crew. The depth mechanism was miscalibrated. The magnetic exploder was overly sensitive. The contact exploder failed at the exact moment of maximum stress, when hitting a ship at the correct angle. Internal components bent or jammed under normal impact speed. In other words, the Mark 14 had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. No amount of bravery or precision from submarine crews could overcome physics. No perfect firing solution could compensate for a broken trigger. No textbook approach mattered if the weapon itself refused to cooperate. When Lockwood reported the findings to higher command, Board initially resisted. They questioned the tests. They challenged the data. They blamed environmental conditions. But this time, the Pacific Fleet had proof, physical, measurable, undeniable. Lockwood authorized immediate field modifications. Crews were ordered to disable the magnetic exploder entirely. Impact pistons were redesigned in the field workshops. Torpedoes were recalibrated manually, one by one, until they matched their intended depth. For the first time in 2 years, submarine commanders felt something they had nearly forgotten: confidence in their own weapons. And yet, beneath this progress, another truth lingered, one that stung far more than technical flaws. This crisis had been avoidable. If tests had been done earlier, if complaints had been taken seriously, if pride hadn't blocked honest evaluation, countless failed attacks might have succeeded. The ocean had been patient. The crews had endured. But now the silence was broken. The Mark 14 would finally be forced to prove itself again, this time with the truth exposed. Fixing the Mark 14 wasn't a single breakthrough. It was a series of small, stubborn victories, earned in workshops, test ranges, and cramped submarine bases scattered across the Pacific. Once Admiral Lockwood had the authority he needed, the process moved quickly. Submarine repair crews at Pearl Harbor and Fremantle began stripping torpedoes apart like surgeons working on a patient they'd finally been allowed to diagnose. The first step was simple: throw out the magnetic exploder. The perfect detonator that Board had praised for a decade had shown itself to be dangerously sensitive to the Pacific's magnetic fields. Submarines disabled it across the fleet, relying only on contact detonation from that moment on. Next came the depth control system. When crews compared the actual running depth to the set depth, the discrepancy was shocking. Torpedoes intended to run at 10 feet were gliding beneath targets at 20 or more. This wasn't a minor flaw. It was a mathematical disaster. Technicians recalibrated every depth mechanism manually. Some used makeshift tools, measuring tanks, and improvised test rigs built from scrap metal. Others worked straight through the night, determined to give submarine crews the reliability they had been denied for too long. But the hardest problem remained: the contact exploder. When a torpedo hit its target at a perfect 90-degree angle, the strongest, cleanest shot, the firing pin bent on impact instead of triggering the explosive. It was a bitter irony. The more accurate the submarine commander, the more likely the torpedo would fail. The solution came not from BUORD, but from the submariners themselves. At Fremantle, officers tested the firing pin against hardened steel plates, observing how it behaved under real impact forces. What they found was undeniable: the internal guide rods were too fragile, and the firing pin's travel path was easily distorted. The crews modified the pins with stronger alloys and redesigned the alignment guides. Not elegant, not according to the Navy's textbooks, but effective. Slowly, patrol by patrol, the Mark 14 transformed. Boats that had limped home with stories of failed attacks began returning with confident, measured successes. Submarine logs, once filled with angry notes about premature detonations, shifted to precise records of freight ships sunk, tankers destroyed, and convoys disrupted. And as the technical fixes spread across the Pacific, something inside the submarine force changed as well. The tension that had once hung inside every control room began to lift. Confidence returned. Fire control teams no longer flinched when the captain called for "Fire 1." Torpedo men regained pride in their craft. For the first time, the torpedo behaved as it had been promised. But this new reliability came with a new awareness. The Mark 14 had never been defeated by the Japanese Navy. It had been defeated by complacency, assumptions, and the refusal to question a comfortable belief in American engineering perfection. Now, with the weapon reborn, the submarine fleet of the U.S. Navy was finally ready to fight the war it had been denied for 2 years. The ocean was vast. The enemy was formidable. But at last, finally, the torpedo could be trusted. By late 1943, the difference was unmistakable. American submarines, once hesitant, frustrated, and betrayed by their own equipment, were suddenly hitting with precision and confidence. The Mark 14, rebuilt by the hands of the very men who depended on it, had finally become the weapon it was always claimed to be. And the ocean began to feel it. Convoy routes once considered safe by the Imperial Japanese Navy turned into dangerous corridors. Tankers, cargo ships, troop transports, vessels critical to Japan's war machine, started disappearing in growing numbers. Submarine patrols that once ended with disappointment now ended with detailed, satisfied reports of confirmed sinkings. The shift was not just tactical. It was strategic. Japan relied heavily on its merchant fleet. Every ship sunk weakened its ability to move oil, iron, rubber, and food across the vast distances of the Pacific. Before the torpedo fixes, American submarines were simply not delivering the damage necessary to tighten the blockade. After the fixes, the effect was dramatic and measurable. USS Wahoo, Tang, Harder, Bowfin, Seahorse, Drum, Darter, boat after boat carved its legacy into the war. Their successes were not luck, nor sudden brilliance. They were the result of a weapon that finally worked as intended. Submarine commanders now approached attacks with assertiveness. They moved closer, fired with confidence, stayed for second shots, and sometimes third. They no longer feared the sickening sight of a perfect torpedo track ending in nothing. Enemy destroyers, once able to shrug off failed attacks, now reacted with urgency. A single American submarine could force an entire convoy to scatter, burning fuel and losing hours of precious time. The psychological balance shifted. The hunter had become a true predator. The Japanese noticed. Their reports, once dismissive of American torpedo effectiveness, began to speak of unexpected accuracy, aggressive enemy submarines, and unusual efficiency. They adapted by changing routes, increasing escorts, and tightening formations. But none of it could stop the growing attrition. By mid-1944, the numbers spoke for themselves. American submarines, only 2% of the Navy's manpower, were sinking over half of Japan's merchant fleet losses. Every torpedo that finally worked represented not just a tactical victory, but a strategic wound that Japan could not heal. Inside the submarines, the mood had transformed. The quiet anger of the early war years was gone. The whispered doubts had faded. Crews felt a sense of justice, not triumph, not pride, but the satisfaction of finally fighting the war on fair terms. When a torpedo struck now, the explosion carried more than destructive force. It carried the weight of every failed patrol, every ignored report, every commander who had fought two enemies at once, the Japanese Navy and the flawed Mark 14. Now, at last, they fought only one. And with each successful patrol, the Pacific grew smaller for Japan, and far more dangerous. By the end of the war, the Mark 14 had redeemed itself. It was reliable, lethal, and finally trusted by the men who depended on it. But the story behind it, the 2 years of silence, denial, and misplaced confidence, left a deep mark on the U.S. Navy. Inside submarine bases, the conversation slowly shifted. Crews no longer whispered about failure. They discussed what had gone wrong, openly and without fear. The culture of silence cracked, and through that opening came hard questions. How could such a critical weapon go untested for so long? Why were frontline commanders dismissed when they raised legitimate concerns? How did institutional pride become more powerful than evidence? The answers were uncomfortable. In Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance faced growing pressure to explain itself. Reports from the Pacific showed a pattern too clear to ignore. The torpedo had never been ready. It had been approved based on assumptions, incomplete trials, and a belief that engineering theory was enough to replace real-world testing. Some officers defended the Bureau. They argued that budget cuts and pre-war constraints forced shortcuts. Others insisted that no one could have predicted the complexity of submarine warfare in the vast Pacific. But among the submarine force, the verdict was clear. The Mark 14 wasn't just a technical failure. It was a failure of accountability. Admiral Lockwood, whose insistence on real testing had broken the silence, became one of the most respected voices in the Pacific Fleet. He rarely used harsh words in public, but he made one statement that echoed through the Navy for decades. If the men in combat say there's something wrong with their weapons, then there is something wrong. And we fix it first. That philosophy didn't just fix a torpedo. It reshaped how the Navy approached weapons development. Live-fire testing became non-negotiable. Field feedback became essential, not optional. And the idea that a weapon was perfect because the designers said so, quietly died. For the submarine crews, the reckoning was personal. They carried memories of failed shots that had cost them opportunities, or put them under depth charge attack. They remembered the frustration of being blamed for problems they knew weren't theirs. And many remembered the moment they realized they could finally trust their own equipment. When the war ended, some officers wrote candid memoirs. Others kept their thoughts to themselves. But a common idea appeared again and again. Technology had not betrayed them. People had. And that realization turned into a lesson passed down through generations of submariners. Trust is built from truth, not from silence. As the Pacific War closed, the Mark 14 was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a reminder of what had happened when silence was allowed to replace evidence, when pride stood in the way of survival. The weapon had been fixed. But the memory of those 2 lost years remained, a warning carved into the history of the silent service. In the final months of the Pacific War, American submarines roamed vast stretches of ocean with a quiet confidence. They knew their boats. They knew their crews. And now, at last, they knew their torpedoes would strike as promised. The silence that had hung over every firing sequence, the hesitation, the doubt, had finally lifted. But the memory of those early patrols remained. Submariners are not men who forget easily. They remember the cold metal of the periscope handles, the low hum of the electric motors, the heavy stillness that falls just before an attack. And they remember the sound that never came, the explosion that should have shaken the sea but didn't. For 2 long years, the Pacific heard too many quiet torpedoes. Now, when a Mark 14 hit and detonated, the rumble carried deeper meaning. It was not just a blast of steel and TNT. It was the echo of a lesson learned at a high cost, that technology is only as strong as the willingness to question it, and the courage to fix it. When the war ended in 1945, The submarine force of the United States stood as one of the most effective naval arms of the conflict. Its boats had strangled Japan's supply lines, isolated its fleet, and helped bring the war to a faster end. But every commander who survived knew that their greatest victories had come after the silence was broken. In halls of remembrance and quiet museum decks, the story of the Mark 14 rarely appears on plaques or engraved metal. It is not the kind of tale that celebrates triumph alone. It is a story of doubt, resistance, frustration, and finally, of truth. A reminder that even in war, the hardest battles are sometimes fought within your own institution. A reminder that listening can save more lives than denying. A reminder that no weapon, no matter how advanced, is above scrutiny. The ocean keeps its secrets. Steel rusts. Paper fades. But the lesson endures. Because beneath the surface of the Pacific, inside those narrow steel hulls, men learned something timeless. Silence is not safety. Silence is not strength. Silence is only the space where mistakes grow, until someone finally dares to confront them. The Mark 14 eventually earned its place in history. But the silence around it shaped its legacy far more than its steel ever did. And long after the last torpedo was fired, long after the war ended, one truth still echoes across the deep. That the first victory is always the courage to speak.